Welcome everybody to Lights on MOR. This is the video interview where we get to talk to authors of MOR articles. And today we're going to talk to Heather Haveman, who's the professor of sociology and management at Haas School of Business. And she has a paper that just came out called Institutional Logics, Motivating Action and Overcoming Resistance to Change. And this has just come out in the spring of 2023. And welcome to Lights on MOR, Professor Haveman. And it's nice to have you on.
Great. I'm glad to be here, Ray, and it's nice to see you again after all these years.
First thing I'd like to mention is that this is not an empirical paper. This is in the dialogue, debate, and discussion section of the journal. And the paper is about institutional logics, which you've written about quite a bit, and applying it to the context of China. But first, let's step back for a second, and can you introduce, briefly what the idea is of institutional logics?
Yeah, the idea of an institutional logic is that it's a set of cultural elements, so symbols and norms and expectations about how things should be operating. So they basically guide action in organizations, and they guide action, moreover, in fields of interrelated organizations.
And then you really distinguish here between the market logic, which has emerged in China, and the state logic, which comes out of a deeper, longer history, and the transition between those, as well as the tension between those. Can you say more about what those two logics are operating in China?
I would say that the easiest way to look at this is to think about state authorities are planning production and distribution. Labor relations are basically in the control of states, so hiring, promotions, compensation, and people who have ties to the Communist Party or the state bureaucracy or both are actually the ones that get ahead.
And how about the market logic?
Western economies, the market logic says that firms maximize profits through competition or product differentiation and price premiums. But in practice, firms are influenced by state needs and demands, as well as the needs to maximize the share price to enrich their owners. People get rewarded for their skill, their education, their experience, and their performance. And we use labor contracts and legislation concerning workers' rights to manage that.
The arc that's covered in the paper is primarily the move from state to markets, and one might have expected earlier that was going to continue, and in some ways that has not, and maybe reverted backwards.
Yes, we realize that what's been going under Xi Jinping for the last 11 years is a little different than what it was doing under earlier presidents. So there you go.
I think at the micro level, there's talk of what's called dynamic constructivist view of culture, where people may have multiple cultural systems internal to themselves.
Yes.
And one or the other gets triggered by a particular interaction. And, and so I can imagine the same company has the same logics, and some forces trigger one versus the other.
Yeah, and we didn't really look at very much investigated micro level analyses. There is a recent book by Chris Marquis and his former graduate student. So I'm just trying to, Kenyan Shao, that was published in 2022, which actually looks at how individuals in charge of organizations differ in the degree to which they have sort of downgraded the state logic and paid attention more to a market logic. And it depended on, for instance, things like whether they were members of the Communist Party, because there's a socialization into the state logic through the socialization, and whether they have other connections to the state with their activities as capitalists, whether they serve the state, or whether the state is a co-owner or a partial controller of a firm.
I also, as I read the paper, I was trying to think whether the state market logic tension was also present in the US or France or Germany historically.
Yeah, I think that France is actually a great example for that, because the central government, first of all, France is a highly centralized government, just as is in China, although there's been some decentralization in the 90s in China. France has a lot of state-owned companies, and there is a great concern for equality and social welfare. And I do believe that China and France are very similar in that kind of tension between the state and the market logic. It's less so in countries like the US that are much more individualistic and much more focused on free enterprises, if there were such a thing. But yeah.
Was there any logic competing with the market logic in the US?
Yeah, there's a religious logic that is in the Christian faith, especially the evangelical versions of that are competing at times. In the 1990s and 2000s, there was or 2000 at least, there was a rise of evangelical Christian political efforts to change how markets work.
So what got you interested in China? I mean, I know you have a long history of looking at institutional logics, but and then your interest in China emerged at some point within that, if I understand right.
I had a graduate student in finance, of all things, take my PhD seminar on organizations in the management group at Columbia. And he audited it. He really wanted to understand social networks. He wanted to understand sort of institutional theory and how that affects organizations, because he was doing research on asset pricing and discovered that asset pricing theory could not predict the listing stock prices of Chinese firms when they opened up a lot of firms that were state-owned to being listed on the market, stock markets. And so he said, I got to use something different. And I think there's mimetic isomorphism going on. And I went, whoa. So he sent me something that was in between a letter and a paper. And I immediately went, Doug, Lisa, what should I read? I have to really understand what's going on in China in this time period and this particular phenomenon. And that piqued my interest.
And then you have a history background too, so that was
Yeah,
right down your alley.
I started I started my undergraduate degree in engineering and switched to history when I realized I didn't like applying science. It was just more fun to study science. And I've long been taking a sort of historical perspective on things. So I understand that at different points in time, things have happened. That's why I'm interested in the dynamics of logics and dynamics of firms.
And then at the end, you make some suggestions for kind of what people might make of this and how this idea could inform, future research.
Yes.
Can you highlight a couple ideas that are ways that you think research should go with this perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I found that speaking of history, most research on institutional logics is ahistorical. It basically it's looking at short time periods, and it's treating Chinese political, legal, and economic circumstances as background facts. It doesn't think about variation in these institutions over time or even across regions. And we know action is grounded in time and space. And there's immense institutional variation over time in China as the economic reforms opened up from the 78 on, and it's been being pulled back under Xi Jinping. There's also huge variation across regions between the coastal regions and the inland regions, for instance. And very little has been done like that. Greve and Shang have a paper in AMJ in 2017 that does that. But we could learn a lot more if we actually took into consideration this kind of variation and we looked at things over time and across regions.
Any last any last kind of thoughts or comments you'd like to share?
I know that Chinese scholars understand that their country is really interesting. It's also increasingly important on a global scale. And I think scholars in other countries are paying a little more attention to China, but they really need to do some work to understand what's been going on in China and understand how it's varied over time and across space. And to work with Chinese scholars, people who are Chinese, who could be in Western countries or they could be in China or nearby, like in Singapore, in order to really get a deep understanding of what's happening in China and to understand the logics that guide action in management.
Well said. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So
This has been a pleasure.
yeah, it's really great to have you on, and I hope everyone has a chance to enjoy reading the article. It's available at MOR issue. If I look exactly, it's issue 19/2023. It's been out for not quite a year, but Hopefully it's out there shaping people's ideas and informing their research.
And having them cite it.
Having them cite it, yes, that's important too. That's important too.